The old man's hands trembled as he lifted the photograph from the mantel. His grandson James, 18 years old, and terrified of the war that waited across the ocean, sat watching him with eyes that hadn't yet learned what loss truly meant. "You think you're not brave enough," Jackson Cole Mitchell said, his voice carrying the weight of 84 years. "Let me tell you about the woman who taught me what courage really is." He settled into the rocking chair that had been there longer than James had been alive, longer than most of the trees visible through the window. Outside, the Arizona sun painted Monument Valley in shades of copper and gold, the same colors it had worn 60 years ago when everything changed. "This was 1878, Jackson began, "and I was dying, though I didn't have the decency to do it quickly." The night pressed against the windows of the Mitchell Ranch like something alive and hungry. Inside the two-story house, built solid with timber hauled from forests 20 miles north, Jackson Cole Mitchell sat at the kitchen table with a ledger that told the story of his slow destruction. 180 nights. He had counted every single one. 180 nights since his youngest daughter Grace had started crying, her small body burning with fever that came and went like seasons, but never truly left. Malaria, the doctor had said before he stopped coming. Nothing to be done except wait and pray and watch her suffer. Jackson had stopped praying around night 97. The numbers in the ledger blurred together. $12 per month. That's what he'd offered the last woman who'd answered his advertisement for help. 47 people had come through that door in 6 months. 47 people had looked at Grace's fever-bright eyes, at Caroline's hostile silence, at Samuel's desperate need for a mother he couldn't remember, and they had all found reasons to leave. The last one hadn't even lasted 3 days. Jackson ran his hand across his face, feeling the stubble that had become a beard without him noticing. When had he last shaved? When had he last slept more than 2 hours in a single stretch? The question felt academic. Time had become something measured in Grace's crying, in the spaces between her screams. Upstairs, right on schedule, the crying began again. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against floorboards worn smooth by feet that would never walk across them again. Sarah's feet. His wife dead 2 years and 4 months, though some days it felt like yesterday, and some days it felt like a lifetime ago. Tuberculosis had taken her the way it took everyone, slowly, with blood on the pillowcase and promises that tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow was never better. Caroline met him at the top of the stairs, 12 years old, and already carrying burdens that would break most grown women. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her eyes held the kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. "I tried the compress again," she said. "It's not working." Jackson nodded. Nothing worked. They'd tried everything Dr. Owen suggested before she'd finally admitted there was nothing more she could do. Willow bark tea, cold baths, prayers to a God who seemed to have turned his attention elsewhere. Grace just kept burning, kept crying, kept slipping further away from them with each passing night. He moved past Caroline into the small bedroom where Grace lay, tangled in sheets, soaked with sweat. 5 years old. She should have been playing with dolls, learning her letters, stealing cookies from the kitchen when she thought no one was watching. Instead, she was disappearing, her small face gaunt, her lips cracked and bleeding. "Papa," she whimpered the word barely more than a breath. "I'm here, sweetheart." He knelt beside the bed, pressing his hand to her forehead. The heat that radiated from her skin made his stomach turn 104 degrees, maybe higher. How much heat could a body that small withstand before it simply gave up? Behind him, Samuel appeared in the doorway, 9 years old and trying so hard to be brave. Is she going to die? The question hung in the air like smoke. Jackson wanted to lie, wanted to promise his son that everything would be fine, that Grace would wake up tomorrow healthy and laughing. But he'd stopped lying to his children around the same time he'd stopped praying. "I don't know, Sam." The boy's face crumpled, but he didn't cry. He hadn't cried in months, not since the night he'd asked if Mama was ever coming back, and Jackson had finally told him the truth. Some lessons came too early, but that didn't make them any less necessary. Jackson stayed with Grace until the crying faded into whimpers, then into the shallow, rapid breathing that terrified him more than the screams. When he finally left her room, the sky outside had begun to shift from black to gray. Another night survived, but not conquered. Downstairs, the ledger still waited. He sat down heavily, adding up numbers that refused to make sense. The ranch held 240 acres good land, with water that never ran dry, or at least it had, before he'd let everything fall apart. Where there had once been 120 head of cattle, now only 52 remained. 3 miles of fence had collapsed. The vegetable garden that Sarah had tended with such care had become a patch of dried earth and dead plants. And the debt. God, the debt. $1,247. That's what he owed Vernon Caldwell at the Prescott Bank. Money borrowed to buy medicine that didn't work to pay for the funeral that had sent Sarah into the ground, but not into peace. The loan had come due 3 months ago. Caldwell had been patient in his way, but patience had limits. 67 days. That's how long Jackson had before the bank could take everything. 67 days to find $1,200 he didn't have to save a ranch he could barely maintain, to keep 3 children who deserved better than a father who'd forgotten how to fight. The sound of wagon wheels on packed earth pulled him from thoughts that circled like vultures. He stood moving to the window just as the sun broke over the ridge, painting the valley in shades of red and gold that would have been beautiful if he'd remembered how to see beauty. A wagon was approaching, pulled by 2 mules that looked as tired as Jackson felt. On the seat sat Father Miguel Santos, the Catholic priest from the mission 30 miles south, a man who'd buried Sarah and probably expected to bury Grace before the year was out. But Father Miguel wasn't alone. Beside him sat a woman Jackson had never seen before. She wore a simple dress the color of dried earth, her long black hair pulled back in a braid that hung to her waist. Even from a distance, even through glass dirty with dust and neglect, Jackson could see the way she held herself, straight-backed, still, like someone who'd learned that any movement might draw the wrong kind of attention. The wagon stopped 20 feet from the house. Father Miguel climbed down with the slow care of a man whose bones remembered too many hard roads. The woman didn't move, didn't look toward the house, didn't acknowledge Jackson's presence in the window, even though he was certain she knew he was there. Jackson opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The morning air carried the scent of sage and dust, the smell of a land that took more than it gave. "Father Miguel?" "Jackson." The priest's face was weathered as old leather, his eyes kind in a way that made Jackson uncomfortable. Kindness felt like pity these days. "I heard you were still looking for help." "I'm always looking for help." Jackson's gaze drifted to the woman still sitting motionless on the wagon seat. "Though I'm not sure what you've brought me this time." Father Miguel turned, gesturing for the woman to join them. She climbed down from the wagon with a fluid grace that spoke of strength held in careful reserve. Up close, Jackson could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 28 or 30, with eyes the color of dark honey and skin that marked her heritage as clearly as a signature. Apache. The word settled in Jackson's chest like a stone. He'd fought Apaches during his time as a scout, after the war had seen what they could do with a knife, with fire with rage that had been earned through generations of betrayal. And now Father Miguel had brought one to his door. "This is Naichi," Father Miguel said, using a name that meant nothing to Jackson. "Though most people call her Naya. She's been working at the mission for 7 years, helping with the sick." "I don't need a missionary," Jackson said, keeping his voice flat. "I need someone who can keep 3 children alive. She's kept 23 people alive in the last year alone." Father Miguel's voice carried an edge Jackson had never heard before. Fevers, infections, wounds that should have killed them. She saved every single one. Jackson looked at the woman, at Naya, searching for some sign of the miracle worker Father Miguel described. She stared back at him with eyes that gave nothing away, neither pleading nor prideful, simply existing in the space between them. "She's Apache," Jackson said, stating the obvious because someone needed to. "She's a healer," Father Miguel corrected, "and you're a father who's watched his daughter suffer for 180 nights. So the question isn't what she is. The question is whether you're desperate enough to let her try." The words hit like a physical blow. 180 nights. Jackson had told no one about his counting about the ledger, where he marked each night Grace cried, each night he failed to help her. But of course, Father Miguel knew. Priests always knew. From inside the house, Grace's crying started again, thin and broken and unbearably familiar. Naya's head turned toward the sound, the first real movement she'd made since arriving. Something shifted in her expression, something Jackson couldn't quite read but recognized anyway. It was the look of someone who'd heard too much crying, who'd learned to recognize suffering in all its forms. "Let me see the child," she said. Her voice was low, accented with Spanish, and something older, carrying an authority that had nothing to do with permission. "Now!" Jackson should have refused. Should have sent Father Miguel and his Apache healer back down the road they'd come from. But Grace was crying, and he'd been failing her for 180 nights, and desperation had a way of making choices that pride would never allow. "Follow me," he said. Inside, Caroline stood at the base of the stairs like a guardian at a gate, her face hard with suspicion. "Who's that someone Father Miguel thinks can help your sister?" "We don't need help from her kind." The words came out sharp as broken glass, and Jackson saw something flicker across Naya's face. Not hurt, not anger, just a kind of weary recognition, as if she'd heard those exact words 1,000 times before and expected to hear them 1,000 more. "Caroline," Jackson said quietly. "Move." His daughter held her ground for 3 heartbeats before stepping aside, her eyes never leaving Naya as the woman crossed the threshold into a house that still smelled like Sarah's lavender sachets and old grief. Grace's crying led them upward. Naya took the stairs without hesitation, moving past Jackson, past Caroline, following the sound like a compass needle finding north. By the time Jackson reached the bedroom doorway, she was already kneeling beside Grace's bed, her hand hovering over the child's forehead without quite touching. "How long has she had the fever?" Naya asked. 6 months, Jackson said. "Comes and goes, but never really leaves. Doctor said it was malaria." Naya's fingers moved to Grace's neck, pressing gently against the pulse point there. Then to her abdomen, feeling the organs beneath skin that had become translucent. She pulled back the blanket, examined Grace's arms and legs with the focused intensity of someone reading a language written in flesh and bone. "She needs 3 things," Naya said, not looking up. "Willow bark for the fever, yarrow to fight the infection, golden seal for the parasites in her blood. Do you have these?" Jackson shook his head. "We tried willow bark. Didn't work." "You tried the bark alone. These 3 together, prepared correctly, will work." Naya stood, turning to face him fully for the first time. "I will find them. But you must keep her cool. Wet cloths on her forehead, neck, and wrists. Change them every 15 minutes. Can you do this?" "Yes." "Then I go now." She moved past him, already heading for the stairs, and Jackson followed her down into the kitchen, where Samuel now sat watching everything with wide, uncertain eyes. "Where will you find these herbs?" Jackson asked. "In the valley. I know where they grow." Naya paused at the door, looking back at him. "I will return before sunset. If I am not back, your daughter will die tonight. If I am back, she will live. Choose whether to believe me." Then she was gone, stepping off the porch and walking toward the valley with long strides that ate up distance, not running, but not wasting a single moment either. Father Miguel appeared beside Jackson, watching her go. "She survived the Camp Grant massacre," the priest said quietly. 1871, 144 of her people killed while they slept. She was 21 years old, lost her mother, brother, and sister in a single morning. Jackson felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard about Camp Grant. Every scout in the territory had. It was the kind of story men told in whispers, the kind that made you wonder what God was doing while children were being butchered. Why are you telling me this? Because you're wondering if you can trust her, and I'm telling you that woman has more reason to hate people like us than you could possibly imagine. But she came anyway. Because a child is suffering, and Naya will walk through fire to help a suffering child, every single time. The priest climbed back onto his wagon, gathering the reins. I'll be back in 2 weeks to check on things. Try not to waste the gift you've been given. He drove away, leaving Jackson standing on a porch that suddenly felt too empty. Inside, Caroline was changing the cloth on Grace's forehead, just as Naya had instructed. Samuel was pumping water from the well, filling bucket after bucket without being asked. And Jackson stood there counting the hours until sunset, wondering if he'd just invited salvation, or something much more complicated, into his dying home. 4 hours passed, then 5. Grace's crying never stopped, just changed pitch and intensity, like a tide governed by pain instead of moons. Jackson kept the cloths cold, kept changing them, kept hoping without quite believing. 6 hours. The sun began its long slide toward the horizon, painting the valley in that peculiar light that made everything look both beautiful and heartbreaking. 7 hours. Jackson was beginning to accept that Naya wasn't coming back, that whatever Father Miguel believed about her dedication to suffering children wasn't enough to overcome the simple fact that she owed them nothing when he saw her figure emerging from the valley's shadows. She carried a cloth bag over one shoulder, walking with the same measured pace she'd left with, as if the 7 hours of searching through desert terrain in afternoon heat had cost her nothing at all. As she drew closer, Jackson could see scratches on her arms from thorns dust coating her dress, but her face remained calm, focused, already moving toward the next task. She didn't knock, just opened the door and walked to the kitchen table, spreading out her harvest. Roots, leaves, bark, all organized with a precision that spoke of years of practice. "You have water boiling?" she asked. Jackson had kept water hot, just in case, a small act of faith he hadn't quite acknowledged until now. "Yes." "Good. Now watch. I will show you once. After this, you must be able to do it yourself." She worked in silence, her hands moving with absolute certainty, crushing bark into powder, measuring leaves with nothing but her fingers and knowledge earned through methods Jackson couldn't begin to guess. Steeping, straining, mixing proportions that seemed to exist more in instinct than measurement. 20 minutes later, she had a tea the color of autumn leaves and handed it to Jackson. "Make her drink all of it, every drop, even if she fights." He carried it upstairs, where Grace lay in that terrible half-sleep that wasn't rest, wasn't peace, just exhaustion too deep for waking. Her eyes opened when he lifted her head, and for a moment, just a moment, he saw fear there. "It's going to help, sweetheart," he said, knowing she probably didn't understand, probably couldn't hear him past the roaring of fever in her blood. "Please drink it." Grace drank. Small sips at first, then longer pulls her body, recognizing something it needed, even if her mind couldn't name it. By the time she finished, Jackson's shirt was soaked with sweat that had nothing to do with the heat. He carried the empty cup downstairs. Naya sat at the table, motionless, waiting. "How long?" Jackson asked. 6 hours, maybe 7. The fever will break or it will kill her. We have done all we can. And if it breaks, then I stay 2 weeks. We see if the fever returns." Naya stood, already moving toward the door. "I sleep in the barn." "There are rooms upstairs," Jackson said, before he could stop himself. She turned, and for the first time something like emotion crossed her face. Not gratitude, something harder, sharper. "I do not sleep in houses that do not want me. The barn is fine." She left before he could respond, and Jackson stood there feeling like he'd failed a test he hadn't known he was taking. Behind him, Caroline appeared from wherever she'd been hiding. "Are we really going to let her stay?" His daughter's voice carried all the betrayal of youth confronting change it couldn't control. "If Grace lives, yes." And if she dies, the question deserved honesty. Then it won't matter. The night stretched out like every night before it measured in minutes that felt like hours, in Grace's breathing, that sounded too shallow, too fast, too much like giving up. Jackson sat beside her bed, his hand on her small shoulder, feeling every tremor that passed through her body. Around midnight, Samuel crept in and sat on the floor, his back against the wall, refusing to leave, even when Jackson told him to get some sleep. An hour later, Caroline joined them, bringing blankets she spread over her brother without a word. They waited together, this family that had been broken by loss and was now held together by nothing more than hope and stubbornness. Outside, the moon rose full and bright, turning the valley into a landscape of silver and shadow. In the barn, Naya probably wasn't sleeping either, just waiting to see if her knowledge had been enough. At 3 a.m, Grace's fever broke. It didn't happen slowly. One moment her skin was burning hot enough to blister, and the next it was merely warm. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow for so long, Jackson had forgotten what normal sounded like, deepened and slowed. And then, for the first time in 180 nights, his daughter slept without crying. Jackson's hand shook as he touched her forehead, confirming what his eyes told him, what his heart was afraid to believe. 99.8 degrees, not perfect, but close enough to count as a miracle. He stood on legs that had forgotten how to hold steady weight and walked downstairs, through the kitchen, out the back door, across the yard, to where the barn stood like a shadow against the star-filled sky. The door stood slightly open. He pushed it wider and found Naya sitting on a hay bale, her eyes open, her posture suggesting she'd been sitting exactly like that since she'd come out here hours ago. "The fever broke," Jackson said, and his voice came out rough as gravel. Naya stood. "Then I will check her." She moved past him, and Jackson followed her back into the house, back up the stairs, to where Grace now slept peacefully for the first time in half a year. Naya performed the same examination she'd done earlier, checking pulse, breathing, the clarity of eyes that flickered open and then closed again without fear. "She will sleep until morning," Naya said. "When she wakes, give her water, small amounts but often. Tomorrow night, more medicine. 3 days of this, then we see." She started for the door, but Jackson's voice stopped her. "Thank you." Naya paused, not turning around. "I did not do this for gratitude." "Then why?" Now she did turn, and in the dim light from the lamp, her eyes held something Jackson recognized, because he'd seen it in his own mirror every morning for 2 years. Loss. The kind that never healed, never faded, just learned to live alongside everything else. "Because children should not suffer for the sins of adults," she said quietly, "and because I could not save my own." Then she was gone, leaving Jackson standing in a hallway that smelled like lavender and old grief, holding a truth he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. When the sun rose the next morning, Grace woke asking for water and breakfast, her voice weak but clear. Samuel laughed for the first time in months. Even Caroline smiled, though she tried to hide it behind her hand. And in the barn, Naya was already awake, already working, already preparing the medicine Grace would need that evening. Jackson found her there an hour after breakfast, mixing herbs with the same focused intensity she brought to everything. "Father Miguel said you'd stay 2 weeks if Grace lived," Jackson said. "I'll pay you $12 a month, plus room and board. I do not work for money." "Then what do you work for?" Naya looked up from her work, meeting his eyes with a directness that most people had forgotten how to manage. "I work for children who deserve better than the world gives them. If that is acceptable, I stay. If not, I go." Jackson thought about pride, about reputation, about what the town would say when they found out he'd hired an Apache woman to care for his children. Then he thought about Grace's smile this morning, about 180 nights that were finally over, about the simple fact that his daughter was alive. 2 weeks, he said. "We'll see how it goes." Naya nodded once, already turning back to her work. 2 weeks. In that night, Samuel found an old wool blanket in the trunk where Sarah had kept her winter things, and carried it out to the barn without being asked. When he came back inside, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been starlight. Jackson stood at the kitchen window watching the barn where a lamp still burned, where a woman who had every reason to hate people like him was choosing to stay anyway. The ledger on the table still showed $1,247 in debt. 67 days until everything was lost. 52 cattle instead of 120. 3 miles of collapsed fence. None of it had changed. But Grace was sleeping peacefully upstairs, and for the first time in half a year, Jackson could hear the silence where her crying used to be. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope felt too fragile, too likely to shatter, but it was something. A beginning, maybe, or just a pause in the long process of falling apart. Either way, it was more than he'd had yesterday. In the barn, Naya extinguished her lamp and lay down on the hay bale that would serve as her bed, covered by a blanket that still carried the faint scent of lavender. She did not sleep. She rarely slept more than a few hours, and never deeply. 7 years since Camp Grant, and the screaming still found her in dreams. But tonight, listening to the desert wind move through the valley, she allowed herself to believe that maybe this time would be different. Maybe these children, this broken family, could be saved. Maybe saving them might save her too. Or maybe she was still just a survivor, trying to fill a void that could never be filled by rescuing other people's children when her own were 7 years in the ground. The question didn't have an answer, so she stopped asking it and waited for morning when the work would begin again. The rooster's cry split the pre-dawn darkness, and Naya was already awake. She had been awake for hours, sitting cross-legged on the hay bale, watching the stars wheel overhead through gaps in the barn's roof. Sleep came in fragments for her brief descents into darkness that always ended the same way: her mother's face, her brother's laughter, her sister's small hand going limp in hers. 7 years, and the ghosts had not learned mercy. She stood shaking off memories like dust and began her morning work. The ranch needed more than a healer. It needed hands willing to labor without counting hours, and Naya had never been afraid of work. By the time the sun painted the eastern ridge in shades of copper, she had fed the horses, collected eggs from the henhouse, and started a fire in the kitchen stove. Jackson came downstairs to find coffee already brewing and cornmeal mush bubbling in a pot. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes red-rimmed from the first full night of sleep he'd managed in months, staring at the simple miracle of breakfast prepared by someone else's hands. "You didn't have to do this," he said. Naya looked up from where she was slicing bread, her expression neutral. "The children need to eat. I am awake. It is simple. Still, I didn't hire you to be a cook." "You did not hire me at all," she reminded him. "I am here for the children. What I do beyond healing them is my choice." Before Jackson could respond, footsteps thundered on the stairs, and Samuel appeared, his hair standing in wild directions, his face bright with the kind of energy that only came from actual rest. Grace followed more slowly, holding Caroline's hand, her steps uncertain but present. Alive. The girl's eyes found Naya, and something flickered across her small face. Not fear. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition of the person who had pulled her back from the edge of a darkness she was too young to name. "Miss Naya made breakfast," Samuel announced, as if this were the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened. Caroline's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, just guided Grace to the table and helped her sit. The morning meal passed in near silence, broken only by the sounds of eating and Grace's occasional soft cough. Naya stood by the stove eating her own portion, standing up watching the family with the detached observation of someone studying a puzzle. When they finished, Jackson pushed back from the table. "I need to ride the fence line today. Check how much damage we're really looking at." "I will come," Naya said. "That's not necessary. Your daughter needs more medicine this evening. The ingredients grow in different parts of the valley. While you check fences, I gather what we need. It is efficient." The logic was unassailable, but Jackson hesitated anyway. Taking Naya into the open valley where anyone passing by might see them together felt like crossing a line he couldn't uncross. But efficiency won over caution the way it always did when choices had to be made. "Sam, you're in charge while we're gone. Caroline, keep an eye on Grace." His eldest daughter's face went hard as stone. "You're leaving us with her. I'm leaving you with your brother and sister. Naya will be with me." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Jackson met his daughter's eyes, seeing Sarah's stubbornness reflected there, along with a fear he understood too well. Change was coming whether they wanted it or not, and Caroline had already lost too much to trust anything new. 2 weeks, he said quietly. "That's all I'm asking. Give her 2 weeks." Carolyn looked away. Her silence, neither agreement nor refusal, just the sound of a child trying to hold together a world that kept insisting on breaking apart. An hour later, Jackson and Naya rode into the valley on horses that had seen better days. The fence line stretched for miles, a testament to ambitions from a time when Jackson had believed the future could be built with wire and posts and enough sweat to make it stick. Now whole sections leaned at drunken angles, or lay flat on the ground trampled by cattle or wind or simple neglect. They rode in silence, Jackson counting the damage in his head, while Naya scanned the landscape with eyes that saw things he couldn't. Twice she dismounted to gather plants moving with practiced efficiency, her hands gentle with stems and roots that looked like weeds to Jackson but held purposes he was only beginning to understand. "You learned this from your grandmother?" he asked during one of these stops. Naya's hand stilled for just a moment. "My grandmother was medicine woman. She taught me the old ways before the reservation, before the soldiers came. She said the plants speak to those who listen." "Do they speak to you?" "Sometimes." She stood tucking yarrow into her gathering bag. "Mostly they just exist, and I know what they can do. It is knowledge, not magic." They continued the fence inspection, and the numbers kept getting worse. 3.2 miles of collapsed fencing, maybe more. Jackson didn't have the materials to fix even half of it, didn't have the money to buy what he needed, didn't have the time to do the work even if resources appeared from thin air. The math was simple and brutal. The ranch was dying. "Tell me about your wife," Naya said as they paused to water the horses at a creek that still ran clear despite the drought. Jackson's first instinct was to refuse to keep Sarah locked away in the private corner of his heart, where grief lived alongside memory. But something about Naya's directness made pretense feel pointless. "Sarah was a teacher before we married, came west with her family in '68. She taught school in Prescott for 2 years before I convinced her that a life on a ranch might be an adventure worth having." He smiled without humor. "Turned out to be more adventure than either of us bargained for." "How did she die?" "Tuberculosis. Took her 3 months from the first cough to the last breath. Doctor said there was nothing to be done. Seems like that's what doctors say about everything out here." Naya crouched by the water watching sunlight fracture across the surface. "My mother died in one morning. My brother, my sister, so many others. The soldiers came at dawn. We were sleeping. We had treaty, we had peace, but it did not matter. When I returned from gathering medicine, my family was gone." The words came out flat, emptied of emotion through years of repetition. Jackson recognized the tone. He used it himself when talking about Sarah, that careful distance between the story and the pain underneath. "I'm sorry," he said, because what else was there to say? Sorry does not bring back the dead. But it is kind of you to say. She stood shouldering her gathering bag. "We should return. Grace will need her medicine before dark." They rode back as afternoon shadows stretched long across the valley. The ranch appeared on the horizon, looking smaller than Jackson remembered, more fragile, as if acknowledging the scale of its disrepair had somehow diminished it physically. "Saturday I need to go into Prescott for supplies," Jackson said as they unsaddled the horses. "You'll come with us." It wasn't a question, but Naya treated it like one anyway. "Is that wise?" "Wise or not, I need to show my face at the bank, and the children can't stay here alone, not with Grace still recovering. So, Yes, you'll come." Naya nodded slowly, her expression suggesting she understood exactly what kind of attention their arrival would draw. "As you say." That night, Grace took her medicine without complaint and slept through until dawn. The second miracle in as many nights. Jackson found himself lying awake in his own bed, staring at ceiling beams he could barely see, thinking about the woman sleeping in his barn. About the way she moved through the world with such careful control, as if any loose gesture might invite disaster. About the fact that in 2 days she had done more for his family than he'd managed in 6 months. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like debt, and Jackson had enough debt already. Saturday arrived wearing the face of a perfect October day, the kind that made Arizona territory feel like something other than a furnace with delusions of habitability. The wagon rattled over packed earth toward Prescott, 15 miles of road that gave Jackson plenty of time to regret his decisions. Naya sat beside him on the bench while Carolyn, Samuel, and Grace occupied the wagon bed, surrounded by empty crates that would carry supplies on the return trip. The children chattered with the kind of energy that came from a rare outing, but Naya remained silent, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she could see their destination long before it appeared. Prescott emerged from the valley like a promise half-kept. 200 souls, give or take, clustered around a main street that boasted a bank, a general store, a church, and enough saloons to keep those souls either saved or damned depending on which establishments they frequented. It was civilization of a sort, the kind that came with rules and expectations and 1,000 unspoken judgments. Jackson pulled the wagon to a stop outside Caldwell's general store. People were already staring. He could feel their eyes tracking the woman sitting beside him, cataloging her features, her dress, the simple fact of her presence, in a place where Apache women appeared only in stories meant to frighten children. "Sam, help me load supplies. Carolyn, keep Grace with you." He turned to Naya. "You should stay with the wagon." "I will stay." She agreed too easily for it to be anything but acceptance of a situation she'd experienced countless times before. Inside the store, Vernon Caldwell stood behind a counter polished to a shine that felt aggressive in its cleanliness. He was a broad man with a face that smiled too much and eyes that smiled not at all. His gaze found Jackson immediately. "Mitchell, haven't seen you in a while." "Been busy with the ranch." "I'm sure." Caldwell's attention shifted to where Samuel was examining jars of hard candy with the intense focus of a 9-year-old conducting scientific research. "How's your daughter, the sick one?" "Better." "Glad to hear it." Caldwell leaned against the counter with studied casualness. "Though I did hear some interesting news, something about you taking in help." Jackson kept his expression neutral as he gathered flour, coffee, and other necessities. "I hired someone to help with the children." "Hired? That's one word for it." Caldwell's smile widened. "Though I'm curious about your choice of employee." Before Jackson could respond, the store's door opened and Eleanor Hargrove swept in, like whether a woman in her late 60s who carried wealth and influence the way other people carried pocket watches. Her granddaughter Lucy trailed behind her, a thin girl of 7 with eyes too large for her face. Mrs. Hargrove's gaze landed on Jackson with the precision of a rifle shot. "Mr. Mitchell, I've been hoping to speak with you." "Ma'am?" "It's come to my attention that you've brought someone of questionable background into your home, around your children." Her voice carried through the store, ensuring that the half-dozen other customers could hear every word. "I wonder if you've considered the implications." Samuel's hand froze over the candy jar. Jackson set down the bag of flour he'd been holding and turned to face Mrs. Hargrove directly. "I've hired help to care for my sick daughter. What implications concern you? Don't play coy, you know exactly what I mean. That woman sitting in your wagon is Apache, the same savages who murdered settlers not 15 years ago, and you've welcomed her into your home, given her access to your children." Mrs. Hargrove's face had gone red with righteous indignation. "Your dear wife would be ashamed." The words landed like a slap. Jackson felt his jaw tighten, felt the old anger rising, the kind that had gotten him into trouble during the war and never quite learned to behave itself. But before he could speak, a small voice cut through the tension. "She saved Grace." Everyone turned. Caroline stood in the doorway holding Grace's hand, her young face set with a determination that made her look years older. "What did you say?" Mrs. Hargrove asked. "Miss Naya saved my sister. Grace was dying and nobody could help her. Not Dr. Owen, not Father Miguel, not anybody. But Miss Naya came and made medicine, and now Grace is better." Caroline's voice shook slightly, but she didn't back down. "So maybe you shouldn't say mean things about someone you don't even know." The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Hargrove stared at Caroline with an expression caught between outrage and something that might have been respect. Caldwell looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant, and Jackson felt a swell of pride in his daughter that nearly knocked him sideways. "Well," Mrs. Hargrove said finally, "children certainly speak their minds these days." She swept out of the store, Lucy scurrying behind her, leaving an atmosphere thick enough to choke on. Caldwell cleared his throat. "That's $18 for the supplies, Mitchell." Jackson paid, gathered his purchases, and shepherded the children out to the wagon where Naya still sat exactly where he'd left her. Her face showed nothing, but he suspected she'd heard every word through the store's thin walls. The ride home passed in contemplative silence. Grace fell asleep against Caroline's shoulder. Samuel counted clouds. And Naya stared at the road ahead as if it held answers to questions she wasn't asking. It wasn't until they'd almost reached the ranch that Jackson spoke. "I should have defended you in there." "Why?" The question caught him off guard. "Because it was the right thing to do." "The right thing," Naya repeated, as if testing the phrase. "What is right changes depending on who speaks. Mrs. Hargrove thinks she is right. You think you are right. I think only that I am here, and words cannot harm me unless I let them. Still, I should have said something." "Your daughter said enough." Naya turned to look at him directly. "She defended me when she did not have to. That matters more than any words you might have spoken." That evening, after Grace had taken her medicine and the children were in bed, Jackson found Naya in the barn preparing the next day's remedies. He stood in the doorway watching her work in the lamplight, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who trusted their knowledge absolutely. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You will ask regardless of my answer." "Fair enough. Why did you agree to come here? Father Miguel could have sent you anywhere. Why a ranch 15 miles from town with a man you'd never met and children who didn't want you?" Naya's hands stilled. For a long moment she didn't respond, and Jackson thought maybe he'd pushed too far. Then she spoke, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "Because Father Miguel said a child was suffering. Because children should not suffer for the failures of adults. Because maybe if I save enough children who are not mine, I will stop seeing the faces of the ones I could not save." She looked up, meeting his eyes with an intensity that made him want to look away. "And because you were desperate. Desperate people do not have the luxury of prejudice. They simply need help. That is something I understand." Jackson nodded slowly, absorbing words that felt like truth, even when they hurt. "For what it's worth, I'm grateful you came. Gratitude is not necessary. Just let me do my work. That I can do." He left her to her preparations and walked back to the house where lamplight glowed in the windows and his children slept safely in their beds. The ledger still showed impossible debt. The fences still lay broken. The ranch still teetered on the edge of collapse. But Grace was alive, and Caroline had found her voice. And somewhere in the barn, a woman who had every reason to hate people like him was choosing to stay anyway. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something that looked like it from the right angle. And after 6 months of nothing but darkness, even borrowed light felt like a kind of miracle. In the barn, Naya finished her preparations and lay down on the hay bale that had become her bed. The blanket Samuel had brought her still smelled faintly of lavender, a ghost of a woman she had never met, but whose children she was learning to love despite every warning she'd given herself. This was dangerous. Caring was dangerous. Every person she allowed herself to care about was another potential loss, another future wound. But the children were innocent, and innocence deserved protection, and maybe that was reason enough. Or maybe she was just tired of being alone with ghosts. The question didn't have an answer, so she stopped asking and waited for sleep that would come in fragments, interrupted by memories that had learned no mercy in 7 years. But tonight, between the darkness and the dawn, she allowed herself to imagine that maybe this family could be saved. And maybe, just maybe, saving them might teach her how to save herself. The third week of October brought cold mornings that turned Monument Valley into a landscape painted in frost and shadow. Naya had been at the Mitchell Ranch for 12 days, and the routines had settled into something resembling normalcy. Grace took her medicine without complaint. Samuel followed Naya through the valley, learning which plants healed and which ones killed. Even Caroline had begun asking questions, her hostility softening into something closer to curiosity. But normalcy, Jackson had learned, was just another word for the moment before everything fell apart. He was mending harness in the barn when he heard the horses approaching. 3 riders moving with the unhurried confidence of men who knew they were expected. Jackson set down his work and stepped into the October sunlight, shading his eyes against the glare. The lead rider was a man Jackson recognized immediately, though they'd never been formally introduced. Marcus Blackwood sat his horse like someone born to command, his shoulders broad beneath an expensive coat, his face carrying the kind of weathered authority that came from years of getting exactly what he wanted. Behind him rode 2 men who had the look of hired muscle, their hands resting too casually near the guns at their hips. "Mr. Mitchell," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of money and power. "I hope I'm not interrupting. What can I do for you, Mr. Blackwood?" The cattle baron smiled, a calculated expression that never reached his eyes. "I've been meaning to speak with you about a business matter. May we talk privately?" Jackson glanced toward the house where Naya was teaching Caroline how to preserve herbs. The last thing he needed was Blackwood's attention landing on her, but privacy meant stepping away from witnesses, and that felt dangerous in its own way. "We can talk here," Jackson said. Blackwood dismounted with the ease of long practice, his boots hitting the packed earth with expensive-sounding thuds. He was a big man, several inches taller than Jackson, and 30 pounds heavier, though most of it looked like muscle gone soft around the edges. "I'll be direct, Mitchell. I'm interested in purchasing your land, all 240 acres. Blackwood pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. "I'm prepared to offer $2,000. That's considerably more than the property's worth given its current condition." Jackson didn't need to look at the paper to know it was a contract already drawn up, just waiting for his signature. "The ranch isn't for sale. Everything is for sale at the right price, and I understand you have certain financial obligations to Mr. Caldwell at the bank. $1,247 to be exact." Due in Claire Blackwood made a show of consulting a pocket watch 54 days. The specific knowledge of Jackson's debt landed like a punch. "How do you know that Vernon and I do business together? He mentioned you might be open to reasonable offers." Blackwood's smile widened. $2,000 would settle your debt and leave you with enough to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere that might be easier for a man in your circumstances. "My circumstances are fine." "Are they?" Blackwood's gaze drifted toward the house, and Jackson saw the moment he spotted Naya through the window. "I've heard interesting stories about your new household arrangements. Can't imagine that's making your situation any easier." Jackson's jaw tightened. "What I do on my own property is my business." Of course. Though you might consider how such arrangements appear to the community, to the bank, to men who make decisions about loans and extensions." Blackwood refolded the contract with deliberate care. "The offer stands for 1 week, Mitchell. After that, I may reassess the property's value downward. Markets change, after all." He remounted his horse with practiced grace, his hired men following suit. Think it over. Sometimes the best decision is knowing when to walk away. They rode off, leaving Jackson standing in his own yard, feeling like a man watching walls close in from all sides. $2,000. It was more than fair. It was probably more than the ranch was worth in its current state. And it would solve everything: the debt, the pressure, the constant weight of trying to hold together something that wanted to fall apart. Except it would mean giving up, leaving, taking his children away from the only home they'd ever known, and admitting that he couldn't make it work. Naya appeared beside him so quietly he didn't hear her approach. That man wants your land. He made an offer. You will refuse. It wasn't a question, but Jackson answered anyway. I don't know yet. If you sell, where will you go? The question hung between them. Jackson didn't have an answer because he hadn't thought that far ahead. Somewhere cheaper, probably. Somewhere the children could start over, somewhere he could find work that didn't require owning land he couldn't maintain. Somewhere Naya wouldn't follow. The thought arrived unbidden, and Jackson pushed it away before it could take root. She was here for 2 weeks. Less than that now. Whatever help she'd provided, it was temporary by design. I need to think about it, he said finally. That night Jackson sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of him and Blackwood's offer beside it. The numbers told a story of inevitable collapse. 54 days until Caldwell could foreclose, maybe 100 cattle left after the winter culling. 3 miles of fence that would cost $400 to replace money he didn't have. A barn that needed a new roof. A well that was starting to run dry in the hottest months. Against all that, $2,000 felt like salvation, wrapped in surrender. He was still sitting there when Naya came in from settling the horses for the night. She moved through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency he'd come to expect, making tea from herbs he couldn't name, pouring it into 2 cups without asking if he wanted any. You are thinking too much, she said, setting 1 cup in front of him. I'm trying to make a decision that affects my children's future. Your children's future is not in land. It is in having a father who does not give up when things become difficult. She sat across from him, wrapping her hands around her own cup. This man Blackwood, he does not offer money from kindness. He wants something more than land. Maybe. Or maybe he just sees an opportunity. Men like him always want more. Naya took a careful sip of tea. In my experience, when powerful men offer help, they are really offering chains. The chains just looked like freedom at first. Jackson studied her across the table, this woman who'd walked into his failing ranch and somehow made it feel less like a tomb. You sound like you've met men like Blackwood before. I have met many men who take what they want and call it business. Her eyes held memories she didn't share. The soldiers who came to Camp Grant, they said they were bringing peace. They brought death instead. But they called it necessary, so it became acceptable. The parallel was uncomfortable but clear. Jackson looked down at the contract, at the neat handwriting that promised solutions to all his problems. Before he could respond, a sound split the night air. Not quite an explosion, but close. A sharp crack, followed by the unmistakable smell of smoke. Jackson was moving before conscious thought caught up, grabbing the rifle from above the door and running into the darkness. Behind him, Naya's footsteps followed. The smell grew stronger as they rounded the barn, and then he saw it. Fire. Not in the barn, but close. Someone had set a blaze in the haystack he'd been saving for winter feed. Flames climbed into the night sky, bright enough to paint the whole yard in shades of orange and red. "The well!" Jackson shouted. "We need water." They fought the fire for an hour, Jackson and Naya hauling bucket after bucket from the well, throwing water onto flames that didn't want to die. By the time they'd beaten it down to smoldering embers, both were covered in soot and ash, their hands blistered from rope and heat. The damage was total. 6 tons of hay, a winter's worth of feed reduced to smoke and carbon. Jackson stood staring at the ruin, doing calculations in his head that all came out the same way. Without that hay, he'd have to sell cattle before winter just to feed what remained. And selling cattle meant less breeding stock come spring, less income, more debt. The math was getting worse by the hour. This was not accident, Naya said, her voice flat. No. The man who came today, Blackwood, maybe. Or maybe just bad luck. But Jackson didn't believe in coincidence, not anymore. The timing was too perfect. The message too clear. Sell or suffer. Caroline appeared in her nightgown, Samuel and Grace behind her. Their faces reflected the dying firelight, showing fear and confusion in equal measure. "What happened?" Caroline asked. "Someone burned our hay." Jackson tried to keep his voice level, tried not to let them hear the defeat creeping in at the edges. "But it's under control now. Go back to bed." "Who would do that?" Samuel's voice cracked on the question. Jackson wanted to lie, wanted to tell his son that it was an accident or a lightning strike or anything except the truth. But he'd promised himself no more lies, not to his children. "I don't know for certain, but we'll figure it out." After he'd gotten the children back inside and settled, Jackson returned to the smoking remains. Naya was crouched beside the ash, examining something in the dim light. "What did you find?" She held up a piece of wood partially burned. "This was in the center of the fire. It is soaked in kerosene. Someone poured accelerant to make certain the hay would burn completely." Jackson took the evidence, feeling anger build in his chest like pressure. This wasn't random destruction. This was calculated, professional. Someone had been paid to send a message, and that someone almost certainly worked for Marcus Blackwood. "We should tell the sheriff," he said. "Will he help?" The question made Jackson pause. Sheriff Walter Grimes was a decent enough man, but he was also practical. He knew where power lived in this territory, and it didn't live on failing ranches run by widowers with more debt than cattle. "Maybe not," Jackson admitted. "Then we prepare ourselves." Naya stood brushing ash from her dress. "If they come with fire next time, they may come with guns." The thought sent cold washing through Jackson's gut. He'd fought in the war, knew what violence looked like, but that had been different. That had been soldiers against soldiers. This was something uglier, more personal. "I need to protect my children." "Yes, and you cannot do that alone." She was right, though admitting it felt like another kind of surrender. Jackson thought of Jacob Thornton, his neighbor 3 miles east. Jacob had been a scout during the war, knew how to handle trouble. If anyone could help, it was him. "Tomorrow I'll ride to Thornton's place. Ask if he'll help us watch the property." Naya nodded. "Good. I will teach the children to recognize danger, where to hide if men come. They're too young for that. I was 7 when soldiers killed my family. Young does not mean safe. It just means unprepared." Her voice carried no bitterness, just the flat certainty of experience. We prepare them or we lose them. Those are the choices. Jackson wanted to argue, wanted to insist that it wouldn't come to that they lived in a civilized territory with laws and order. But the smoking hay told a different story. "All right," he said, "we prepare." The next morning, Jackson rode to Jacob Thornton's ranch under a sky-threatening rain. Jacob met him on the porch, a man in his late 50s, with gray hair and hands scarred from decades of hard work. He listened to Jackson's story without interruption, his face growing harder with each detail. "Blackwood's been doing this for years," Jacob said when Jackson finished. "Buying up small ranches one way or another, usually the other way. I've held onto my land because I've got nothing left to lose, but you with children?" He shook his head. "That's a different calculation. I'm not selling, even if it means putting your kids in danger." The question hit like a physical blow. "What choice do I have? If I sell, we lose everything anyway. At least fighting gives us a chance." Jacob studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll help. But understand something, Mitchell. Men like Blackwood don't stop at burned hay. They escalate. You're choosing a fight that might get people killed." "I know. Do you?" "Because knowing and being ready are different things." Jacob stood, moving to the edge of his porch. "I'll come by tomorrow. We'll set up watches, prepare defenses. but you need to be sure about this. Once we start, there's no backing down." Jackson thought about Grace's smile that morning at breakfast, about Samuel's questions regarding which plants were safe to eat, about Caroline's slow thaw toward Naya, the way she'd started calling her by name instead of "that woman," about the ranch that Sarah had loved that held memories in every board and nail. "I'm sure," he said. That evening, as Naya prepared Grace's medicine, Jackson told her about the conversation with Jacob. She listened without comment, her hands never stopping their precise work. "This will be difficult," she said when he finished. "I know. People may die. I know that too." She looked up at him, then her eyes holding something he couldn't quite read. "Why fight? You could take the money, start somewhere new. Keep your children safe. Because running doesn't keep them safe. It just teaches them that when things get hard, you give up. And I've already taught them too many lessons about loss. I won't teach them that one too." Naya returned her attention to the medicine, but Jackson thought he saw the ghost of a smile cross her face. "Then we fight, and we prepare to win." Over the next 3 days, Jacob came by each morning to help establish defensive positions. He showed Jackson and Naya how to set up fields of fire from the barn and house, where to position water buckets in case of fire, how to create barriers that would slow down riders without being obvious enough to provoke immediate attack. And Naya taught the children. She showed them the hiding place beneath the barn floor, accessed through a trapdoor, concealed under hay bales. She made them practice getting there quickly, timing them until they could reach safety in under a minute. She taught them to recognize the sound of horses approaching at night, to tell the difference between normal ranch activity and something dangerous. Carolyn hated every lesson, but she learned them anyway. Samuel treated it like a game at first, until Naya explained exactly why they needed to know these things. After that, he stopped smiling and started paying attention. Grace was too young to understand, but she learned to follow her siblings without question when they said it was time to hide. On the 4th night, Jackson sat on the porch with Naya after the children had gone to bed. The valley stretched out before them, beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. "In my village, before the soldiers came, we had a saying," Naya said quietly. "The strongest trees grow in the strongest winds." I did not understand it then. I thought it was about endurance. But now I think it means something else. What? That the wind does not care if the tree stands or falls. It blows regardless. Strength is choosing to grow roots deep enough that the wind cannot move you even when it tries. She turned to look at him. "You are growing roots, Jackson Mitchell. Your children will remember that. If we survive. We will survive. The question is what we become through surviving." Jackson wanted to believe her, wanted to think that fighting Blackwood was about more than just keeping land, that it was about teaching his children something worth knowing about, proving that some things deserved protection even when the cost was high. But mostly, he was just tired. Tired of losing, tired of fighting, tired of being strong when all he wanted was to rest. As if sensing his thoughts, Naya stood. "Sleep tonight. I will watch. Tomorrow we continue preparing. The day after we see what they send." She disappeared into the darkness, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts, and the contract from Blackwood still sitting on his kitchen table unsigned but not forgotten. 51 days until the debt came due. 6 tons of hay gone. Winter approaching. And somewhere out there, Marcus Blackwood was planning his next move, confident that eventually Jackson would break. The only question was whether that confidence was justified. Jackson went inside, checked on his sleeping children one more time, and lay down in a bed that felt too big and too empty. Through the window he could see the barn where Naya kept her vigil, a shadow among shadows, watching for threats that might come tonight or tomorrow or never. But definitely coming eventually. That much was certain. The attack came on the night of October 9th, 3 weeks after Naya had first arrived at the Mitchell Ranch. The moon hung full and bright over Monument Valley, turning the landscape into something from a fever dream, all silver edges and black shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Jackson was on watch, sitting in the barn loft, with Jacob's rifle across his knees and his own pistol within easy reach. Below, the horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, sensing something wrong in the air. Animals always knew before people did. That was a lesson the war had taught him back when he was young enough to think survival was a matter of skill rather than luck. The first sign was the smell. Kerosene sharp and chemical carried on wind that had been clean just moments before. Jackson was moving before his mind fully processed the information, swinging down from the loft with practiced ease, despite the bad leg that hadn't been right since Antietam. "Naya," he called quietly toward the house. She appeared in the doorway instantly, already dressed, already alert. In 3 weeks, Jackson had learned that she never really slept, just rested with one eye open and both ears listening. Whatever had happened at Camp Grant had taught her that safety was an illusion people told themselves before the killing started. "I smell it too," she said. Then the night exploded into motion. 8 riders came from the east, moving fast, their horses' hooves thunder against packed earth. They carried torches that streamed fire behind them like comets, and Jackson recognized the tactic immediately. It was what you did when you wanted to scare more than kill, when you wanted to drive people out into the open where they were vulnerable, unless those people had been preparing for exactly this. "Now!" Jackson shouted. The barn's wide doors slammed shut, the heavy timber bars dropping into place with sounds like gunshots. Naya was already at the house, shepherding the children down to the hidden space beneath the barn floor. Carolyn went first, carrying Grace with Samuel right behind. The whole operation took 43 seconds. They'd practiced it 17 times over the past 3 days. Jackson took position at the barn's second-story window, the one that gave a clear line of sight across the yard. Beside him, Jacob Thornton appeared from the shadows where he'd been keeping his own watch, an old Henry rifle cradled with the familiarity of long acquaintance. 8 riders, Jacob said calmly. Could be worse. Could be better. The riders circled the yard, once torches held high, probably expecting panic and surrender. When neither materialized, they pulled up short about 50 yards from the house. The lead rider, a man Jackson didn't recognize, but whose type he knew well, called out in a voice rough from whiskey and violence, "Mitchell, we don't want trouble. Just come out and talk." "Talking happens in daylight," Jackson called back. "Nighttime visitors with torches aren't here for conversation." The rider laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Fair enough. Then let me be direct. Mr. Blackwood sent us to deliver a message. You've got 24 hours to reconsider his offer. After that, things get difficult." They already look difficult. This is just us being neighborly. Difficult looks different. To emphasize the point, 2 of the riders wheeled their horses and threw their torches toward the barn. The brands arced through the air, trailing sparks, and landed on the roof where Jackson had soaked the shingles with water an hour before sunset. The flames caught, sputtered, caught again. Jacob's rifle spoke once a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. One of the torches went flying as the rider who'd thrown it jerked backward, grabbing his shoulder. "That's your warning shot," Jacob called out. "The next one kills somebody." The riders pulled back, but they weren't leaving. Jackson could see them conferring, probably deciding whether 8 against 2 was good enough odds to risk dying for whatever Blackwood was paying them. Then Naya appeared on the house's second floor, framed in the window, with a bow drawn and an arrow nocked. In the moonlight, she looked like something from an old story, the kind where women were warriors, and men learned too late that underestimating them was fatal. "Now it is 8 against 3, she called out, "and I do not miss at this distance." Jackson had seen Naya practice over the past week, shooting at targets Jacob had set up at various ranges. She'd put arrows through fence posts at 100 yards with casual precision that suggested the bow was an extension of her arm rather than a separate tool. But the riders didn't know that. They just saw a woman with a weapon, and some men made the mistake of thinking that wasn't worth worrying about. The lead rider was smarter, or maybe just more experienced. He studied Naya for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll be going then, but the offer expires at sunset tomorrow. After that, what happens is on you, Mitchell." They rode out the way they'd come, taking their wounded companion and their threats with them. The fire on the barn roof was already dying, starved for fuel on wet shingles. Within minutes, the night was quiet again, except for the wind and the restless stamping of horses who knew something had happened but didn't understand what. Jackson waited 10 minutes before leaving his position just to make sure it wasn't a trick. When he finally climbed down from the loft, his hands were shaking with adrenaline that had nowhere to go. Jacob appeared beside him, checking the barn doors and the perimeter with the methodical care of someone who'd survived this long by never assuming the danger was over. Naya emerged from the house, her bow still in hand, but the arrow back in its quiver. "The children are safe. Scared but safe." "How bad is the damage?" "The roof will need patching, otherwise just smoke and fear." As she looked toward where the riders had disappeared into darkness. "They will come back, I know. Next time, they will come to kill, not frighten." Jackson nodded because what else was there to say? The message had been delivered and the response had been given. Now they waited to see who blinked first. In the morning, Jackson rode into Prescott to see Sheriff Walter Grimes. The sheriff's office occupied a small building next to the jail, a structure that suggested law enforcement was an afterthought in a town more concerned with commerce than justice. Grimes was a solid man in his 50s, with a face that had learned to show nothing and eyes that calculated odds before taking action. He listened to Jackson's report about the night riders without visible reaction, occasionally making notes on paper that would probably go into a file and never be seen again. "You recognize any of them?" Grimes asked when Jackson finished. "No. But you're sure they worked for Marcus Blackwood?" "They said as much. Saying and proving are different things, Mitchell. You got witnesses besides yourself. Jacob Thornton was there, and Naya Whitehorse." Grimes's pen stopped moving. "The Apache woman. She's a witness same as anyone." "Is she?" The sheriff leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "Because in my experience, courts don't put much stock in testimony from people who aren't citizens, and Apaches aren't citizens last I checked. So you're not going to do anything." "I'm going to make a report. I'm going to ask Mr. Blackwood if he knows anything about riders harassing you, and he's going to say no he doesn't, and that'll be the end of it." Grimes spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Unless you've got evidence that would stand up in court, there's not much I can do." Jackson stood, recognizing a dead end when he hit one. "Appreciate your time, Sheriff." "Mitchell." Grimes's voice stopped him at the door. "Word of advice. Marcus Blackwood is a man with resources and connections. Fighting him is like fighting the weather. You might win a battle or two, but you won't win the war. Sometimes the smart thing is knowing when you're beaten. And sometimes the smart thing is standing your ground even when it's hard." Jackson turned to leave, but Grimes's voice stopped him one final time. "Mitchell, off the record." The sheriff's tone had changed, quieter now, almost human. "My daughter was sick 2 years back, real sick. Fever that wouldn't break. Dr. Owen couldn't help her. You know who did?" Jackson turned back slowly. "That Apache woman of yours. Naya rode 15 miles through a storm to bring medicine when nobody else would come. Sat with my daughter all night making sure the fever broke proper. My girl lived because of her." "Then why won't you help me now?" Grimes looked away, jaw tight. "Because right now helping you openly costs me my job and maybe my life. Blackwood owns half this county, and the other half is too scared to stand against him." He met Jackson's eyes again. "But there's a difference between won't and can't. Between what I can do in daylight and what I might do when it really matters." It wasn't a promise, but it was more than nothing. "I'll remember that, Sheriff. See that you do." Jackson left, and though he still felt Grimes's eyes on his back, the weight felt different now. Not hostile, just watchful. Waiting. The message was clear. Whatever happened between him and Blackwood, the law wouldn't interfere. They were on their own. He stopped at Caldwell's general store on the way out of town, partly for supplies and partly because he wanted to take the town's temperature. Vernon Caldwell greeted him with the same false warmth he always did, his smile too wide and his eyes too calculating. "Mitchell, surprised to see you in town 2 weeks in a row. Needed some things." Of course. Caldwell began gathering items from Jackson's list, moving with practiced efficiency. "Though I have to say I was sorry to hear about your troubles last night." Jackson's hand stilled on the counter. "How did you hear about that small town? Word travels." Caldwell's smile didn't waver. "Must have been frightening for your children. All that noise and commotion in the middle of the night." The implication was clear. Someone had reported back to Caldwell probably within hours of the attack, which meant the banker was either working with Blackwood or getting information from someone who was. "We managed fine, I'm sure, though it does make a man think about security, about whether a ranch that far from town is really the safest place for a family." Caldwell slid a piece of paper across the counter. "Your account balance current as of this morning, with interest." Jackson looked at the number. $1,312. The debt had grown, as debt always did. 49 days until it's due, Caldwell said helpfully. "Though, of course, if you wanted to settle early, I'm sure we could work something out. I'll pay on time. Will you—" Caldwell's smile finally faded. "Because from where I'm sitting, Mitchell, you're a man running out of options. Cattle prices are down. Winter's coming. And now you've got night riders burning your property. Seems to me like the universe is trying to tell you something." Jackson gathered his supplies without responding. He paid in cash he couldn't really spare and left with the distinct impression that Vernon Caldwell knew exactly what was coming and was positioned to profit from it either way. The ride back to the ranch gave him time to think, which was both good and bad. Good because he needed to plan. Bad because the more he thought, the clearer it became that Grimes and Caldwell were both right. He was a man running out of options, fighting forces with more money and fewer scruples. But surrendering meant losing the ranch, losing the land Sarah had loved, teaching his children that bullies won if you let them push hard enough. And Jackson had learned a lot of hard lessons in his life, but he'd never learned how to quit. When he reached the ranch, he found Naya in the barn teaching Samuel how to track by reading Disturbed Earth. The boy was crouched low, studying hoofprints with intense concentration while Naya pointed out details invisible to untrained eyes. 8 horses, Samuel announced proudly. One of them favors its left front leg. "Good," Naya said. "And what does that tell you? That if they come back, we'll know which horse was here before." "Very good." Jackson watched them for a moment, this Apache woman teaching his son skills that came from a culture most white people feared and misunderstood. A month ago he would have stopped it. Now he recognized it for what it was, practical knowledge that might keep Samuel alive when civilization's rules no longer applied. That evening, after the children were in bed, Jackson sat with Naya and Jacob on the porch. The valley stretched out before them, beautiful and treacherous, holding secrets in every shadow. "They'll come again," Jacob said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Soon, probably. Blackwood's not a patient man, and you embarrassed his hired guns. He'll want to make a point." Naya was sharpening arrows, the rhythmic scrape of stone on metal a counterpoint to the conversation. "How many men can Blackwood send?" "As many as he can afford," Jacob said, "which is considerably more than we can field. Even with Dr. Owen and Father Miguel helping, we're looking at maybe 8-10 people willing to stand with us. Blackwood can hire 50 guns if he wants to spend the money." "Then we must make him not want to spend it," Naya said. "We make the cost too high. We make fighting us more expensive than leaving us alone." Jackson looked at her, seeing the tactical mind working behind eyes that had survived a massacre. "You've thought about this before." "I have thought about survival every day for 7 years. Sometimes survival means hiding. Sometimes it means fighting. The key is knowing which tactic fits which moment." She tested an arrow's point against her thumb, This moment requires fighting. 3 days later, on the night of October 12th, they came again. This time there were 12 riders, and they came with more than torches. They came with rifles and shotguns, with rope for hanging and kerosene for burning, with the kind of organized purpose that suggested someone had given them specific instructions and promised good money for following through. But Jackson and his allies were ready. The children were already in the hidden space beneath the barn, this time with Dr. Margaret Owen watching over them. The doctor had arrived that morning with medical supplies and a determination that surprised Jackson. Apparently, Naya had saved enough lives in Prescott that some people remembered debts. Jacob Thornton was in the barn loft with his Henry rifle and 3 boxes of ammunition. Father Miguel, despite being in his 60s and theoretically a man of peace, had positioned himself in the house with a shotgun older than Jackson and a willingness to use it that spoke to complicated history. And Naya was on the house's roof, invisible in shadow, with her bow and 24 arrows that she'd spent the week preparing. Jackson took position at the barn's ground floor, where he could move quickly and provide covering fire for multiple angles. He'd fought in enough battles during the war to know that plans collapsed the moment shooting started, but preparation at least gave you options when chaos descended. The riders approached more cautiously this time, staying spread out, their weapons visible and ready. The lead man, the same one from before, but now with his right arm in a sling from Jacob's warning shot, pulled up just outside effective range. "Last chance, Mitchell," he called. Blackwood says the offer drops to $1,500 after tonight. And after tonight, well, there might not be much left to sell. Jackson stepped into the doorway where he could be seen, his rifle held casual but ready. "Tell Blackwood I'm not selling. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Your funeral." The rider gestured, and 2 men spurred their horses forward, throwing bundles of kerosene-soaked rags toward the barn and house. They'd learned from last time. The bundles were heavier, designed to stick and burn rather than bounce off wet shingles. Jacob's rifle cracked twice in rapid succession. The first round shattered a kerosene bottle in midair, sending burning fuel spraying back toward the riders. The second caught one of the horses in the hindquarters, sending it bucking and screaming, throwing its rider into the dirt. Then Naya's arrows began falling like judgment from a dark sky. The first took a rider in the shoulder, the impact spinning him sideways in his saddle. The second caught another in the thigh, punching through leather and muscle with the kind of precision that came from years of practice and a lifetime of necessity. The third missed, but only because the target moved at exactly the wrong moment. The riders scattered, returning fire in a ragged volley that shattered windows and punched holes through barnwood but hit nothing vital. Jackson added his own shots, aiming for horses rather than men, when possible, trying to reduce mobility without adding to a body count that was already getting complicated. One of the riders managed to reach the house, throwing his kerosene bundle onto the porch where it burst into spreading flame. But Father Miguel was ready with buckets of water, dousing the fire before it could catch properly, then firing his shotgun through the broken window in a blast that sent the rider scrambling for cover. The battle lasted 7 minutes that felt like hours. When it ended, 3 riders were wounded, 2 horses were down, and the remaining men were retreating fast, dragging their casualties with them and leaving threats unspoken because the speaking had failed. Jackson stepped out into the yard, checking for injuries and counting the cost. The barn had bullet holes that would need patching. The house's front window was destroyed. Several fence posts were splintered, but no one on their side was hurt beyond cuts from flying glass. It felt like victory, except Jackson knew better. This wasn't the end. It was just the first real engagement in a war that would keep escalating until someone stopped it. Naya climbed down from the roof with fluid grace, her quiver noticeably lighter, but her expression unchanged. "They will report this to Blackwood. He will send more men next time." "Let him," Jacob said, checking his rifle with the automatic care of long habit. "We proved we can hurt them. That's worth something." It's worth time, Jackson agreed. But time isn't the same as winning. Dr. Owen emerged from the barn with the children, who were wide-eyed and pale but unharmed. Grace ran to Jackson, wrapping her small arms around his legs and holding on like she'd never let go. Samuel looked torn between fear and excitement. Caroline just looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying too much weight too young. "Is it over?" she asked. Jackson wanted to say yes, wanted to promise his daughter that the worst had passed and safety was returning. But he'd promised no more lies. "For tonight," he said. "But we need to be ready in case they come again." That night, after everyone else had finally managed to sleep, Jackson found Naya sitting on the porch steps, staring at the valley like it held answers she was trying to read in starlight. "You were right," he said, sitting beside her, "about them coming back, about it getting worse. Being right does not feel like victory. No, it doesn't." Jackson looked at his hands, seeing burns from fighting fires and calluses from holding rifles. "I keep thinking about what the sheriff said, about knowing when you're beaten. Do you believe you are beaten? I believe I'm a man with 3 children fighting a battle against someone with more money and fewer morals. The math isn't in my favor." Naya was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried weight beyond the words. "After Camp Grant, after my family died, I had a choice. I could die with them, or I could live despite them being gone. Living felt like betrayal. It felt wrong, but I chose it anyway because dying would waste the gift they gave me." "What gift?" "Time. They died so I could gather medicine away from camp. Their deaths bought my life whether I wanted that trade or not. So I chose to make their sacrifice mean something." She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting starlight. "Your wife gave you 3 children before she died. That was her gift. Are you going to waste it by giving up when things get hard?" The question hit like a physical blow. Jackson thought about Sarah, about the way she'd believed in this ranch even when he'd doubted, about how she'd loved this land and wanted to build something lasting here, about her last words whispered through blood-flecked lips, "Take care of our babies." "No," he said quietly, "I'm not giving up." "Good. Then we continue preparing, because Blackwood will send more men. And next time they will come to kill, not just frighten." She was right. Jackson knew she was right. But sitting there in the darkness beside a woman who'd survived horrors, he couldn't imagine who'd chosen to keep fighting. Even when fighting felt impossible, he found something he'd thought was lost. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too fragile for what they faced. But determination, stubbornness, the simple refusal to let bullies win just because they pushed hard enough, it wasn't much. But it was enough to face another day. And sometimes that was all you needed. The summons arrived on October 15th, delivered by a deputy Jackson had never seen before, a young man who wouldn't meet his eyes when handing over the official document. Jackson read it standing in his yard, while Naya fed chickens nearby, her movements steady, but her attention focused on him. "What is it?" she asked when the deputy had ridden away. "Court. Vernon Caldwell is petitioning to foreclose on the ranch. Says I've defaulted on payment terms." Jackson crumpled the paper, then smoothed it out again, because destroying it wouldn't change what it said. "Hearing is set for October 17th, 2 days from now." Can he do this? The debt is not due for 46 more days. Apparently there's a clause about maintaining property value, the damage from the attacks, the burned hay, the lost cattle. Caldwell is claiming the collateral has depreciated below the loan value, which gives him the right to call it due immediately. Naya set down the feed bucket, wiping her hands on her apron. "This is Blackwood's doing." "Of course it is. He burns my hay, then uses the damage to justify foreclosure. It's clean, legal, and I walked right into it." Jackson sank onto the porch steps, feeling the weight of accumulated defeats pressing down. Every time he thought he'd found solid ground, it shifted beneath him. Every time he built something, someone knocked it down. And now the law itself was being weaponized against him. "We need help," Naya said. "From who the sheriff won't help. The judge is probably in Blackwood's pocket. We're alone in this." "No." Naya's voice carried quiet certainty. "We are not alone. Dr. Owen helped us fight. Father Miguel stands with us. Jacob Thornton risks his life. And there are others in town who remember what I have done for them. We gather these people. We show the judge that you are not just one man against Blackwood. You are part of a community." Jackson wanted to believe her, but belief felt dangerous. Every time he'd relied on other people, they disappointed him. Sarah dying despite doctors, neighbors who'd promised help, then disappeared when things got hard. A government that talked about justice while looking the other way when powerful men broke the law. But Naya was watching him with eyes that had survived worse than this and kept fighting anyway. And maybe that was enough. "All right," he said. "We gather people." The next day, Jackson rode into Prescott with Naya and Dr. Margaret Owen. The doctor had insisted on coming, saying she had business in town anyway, though Jackson suspected she just wanted to lend respectability to his cause. An Apache woman and a widowed rancher made for poor optics. Adding a respected physician changed the calculation. Their first stop was Father Miguel's mission on the edge of town. The old priest listened to Jackson's situation with the patient attention of someone who'd heard every variety of human trouble and learned not to be surprised by any of it. "Blackwood has been working toward this for months," Father Miguel said when Jackson finished. "The attacks were never just about frightening you. They were about creating legal justification for foreclosure. Can you help? I can testify that the attacks were unprovoked and directed by Blackwood's men. I can speak to your character and Naya's contributions to the community. But Jackson, you must understand something." The priest leaned forward, his weathered face grave. "Judge Wallace is a fair man, but he's also a practical one. He won't rule against Blackwood without substantial evidence. Testimony alone may not be enough." "Then what will be enough?" Father Miguel glanced at Naya, who'd been standing silently by the window. "We need to prove that Caldwell and Blackwood are working together, that the foreclosure is not a legitimate banking action, but part of a conspiracy to steal your land." "How do we prove that?" "We find someone willing to tell the truth, someone on the inside." The answer came from an unexpected source. That evening, as Jackson prepared to return to the ranch, a young man approached him outside Caldwell's general store. He was perhaps 21, well-dressed in the way of town boys who'd never done hard labor, with nervous eyes that kept darting around like he expected attack from any direction. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Thomas Caldwell, Vernon's son." Jackson studied the boy, seeing the resemblance in the jawline and the way he held his shoulders. "What can I do for you, Thomas?" "It's more what I can do for you, sir." Thomas pulled Jackson into the alley between buildings, away from potential witnesses. "I know about the foreclosure. I know it's not legitimate. My father and Marcus Blackwood have been planning this for 3 months. They want your land because of the underground spring. Blackwood believes it connects to 7 other ranches in the valley. Control your water, and he controls everyone." Jackson's pulse quickened. "Can you prove this?" "I've seen documents, contracts between my father and Blackwood outlining how they'll split the profits once they force out all the small ranchers, letters discussing the attacks, the timing, everything." Thomas's hands shook slightly. "I can testify to what I've seen. I can bring the documents." "Why would you do that? That's your father." "Because it's wrong." Thomas met Jackson's eyes with something that looked like desperation. "I've watched him destroy good people for money my whole life. I thought that's just how business worked. But what he's doing to you, to your children, using the law as a weapon against a man who's just trying to survive, that's not business, that's evil. And I won't be part of it anymore." Jackson wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that justice could come from unexpected places. But he'd been burned too many times. "If you testify against your father, he'll disown you. You'll lose everything." "I know." Thomas's voice was steady despite his shaking hands. "But I'll still be able to look at myself in the mirror. Right now, I can't do that." Naya appeared at the alley entrance, her presence silent as always. She studied Thomas with the kind of assessment that missed nothing. "He speaks truth," she said finally. "I hear it in his voice, see it in how he stands." Thomas looked at Naya with something between fear and awe. "You're the healer, the one who saved Eleanor Hargrove's granddaughter." "I am." "Then you know what it's like to be judged for things you didn't do, for who your people are rather than who you are." Thomas straightened his shoulders. "I'm being judged by my father's actions every day. I'm choosing to be different. Please let me help." Jackson extended his hand. "Court is tomorrow at 10. Be there with those documents." Thomas shook his hand, his grip stronger than Jackson expected. "I will. And Mr. Mitchell, thank you for giving me the chance to do the right thing." The young man disappeared into the evening crowd, leaving Jackson and Naya standing in the alley. "Do you believe him?" Jackson asked. "I believe he wants to do right. Whether he has the courage when the moment comes, we will see." Naya started walking toward their wagon. "But we prepare as if he will not appear. Hope for the best, but do not depend on it." That night Jackson sat with Dr. Owen and Father Miguel at the mission, planning their strategy for court. They compiled a list of witnesses who could speak to Jackson's character, to the unprovoked attacks, to Naya's contributions to the community. It wasn't enough to prove conspiracy, but it might be enough to create reasonable doubt. Eleanor Hargrove agreed to testify, her influence in Prescott society worth more than a dozen other witnesses. Jacob Thornton would speak to the attacks he'd witnessed. Dr. Owen would confirm that Naya's medical skills had saved lives that conventional medicine couldn't. And if Thomas Caldwell appeared with his documents, they might actually have a chance. The morning of October 17th dawned cold and clear, the kind of day that felt like nature wasn't paying attention to human concerns. Jackson dressed in his only good suit, the one he'd worn to Sarah's funeral, and tried not to see the symbolism in that. Caroline, Samuel, and Grace stayed at the ranch with Jacob's wife Emma, who'd come over specifically to watch them. Jackson had wanted to spare them the courtroom to shield them from seeing their father potentially lose everything in front of strangers, but Caroline had insisted on coming. "If we're going to lose our home, I want to see who takes it from us," she'd said with her mother's stubbornness, "and if we win, I want to be there for that too." And so she sat in the courtroom's front row, 12 years old and fierce, while Samuel and Grace remained at the ranch under Emma's watchful care. Judge Henry Wallace entered at exactly 10 o'clock, a man in his 60s with white hair and a face that suggested he'd seen every trick lawyers could pull, and wasn't impressed by any of them. He took his seat behind the bench, adjusted his spectacles, and looked down at the papers before him. Case of Caldwell versus Mitchell regarding foreclosure of property. Mr. Caldwell, you're petitioning for immediate foreclosure based on depreciation of collateral. Present your argument. Vernon Caldwell stood, and Jackson was struck by how ordinary he looked. Not evil, not obviously corrupt, just a businessman in a good suit making a case that happened to destroy lives. Your Honor, the facts are straightforward, Mr. Mitchell borrowed $1,247 secured by his ranch. The loan agreement stipulates that the collateral must maintain a minimum value of $2,000. Recent events, including fire damage and loss of livestock, have reduced the property's value below that threshold. Therefore, I'm exercising my legal right to call the loan due immediately. Mr. Mitchell, how do you respond? Jackson stood, feeling every eye in the courtroom on him. The benches were more crowded than he'd expected. Word had spread that this case was about more than one man's debt. It was about whether powerful men could use the law to steal from those who couldn't fight back. Your Honor, the damage to my property was caused by arson and vandalism, directed by Marcus Blackwood, who wants my land. Vernon Caldwell knows this because he and Blackwood are working together. This foreclosure isn't about banking, it's about theft, dressed up in legal language. Wallace's eyebrows rose. Those are serious accusations. Do you have evidence? I have witnesses who can testify to the attacks and to the conspiracy behind them. Then call your witnesses." Jacob Thornton went first, describing the night attacks with the precise detail of a man who'd been in combat and knew how to observe under pressure. He confirmed that the writers had mentioned Blackwood's name, that the attacks were organized and professional, designed to cause maximum economic damage. Dr. Owen testified next, explaining how the loss of the haystack had been calculated to force Jackson into selling cattle early, further reducing his ranch's value. She also spoke about Naya's medical contributions, establishing that the Apache woman Caldwell was trying to use as evidence of poor judgment had actually saved lives throughout Prescott. Eleanor Hargrove took the stand wearing her finest dress and her most intimidating expression. "My granddaughter would be dead without Naya Whitehorse. Mr. Mitchell showed courage in bringing her to his ranch, not poor judgment. And as for his financial situation, it seems to me that a man being attacked by hired thugs shouldn't have his property stolen because he defended himself." Father Miguel testified about finding Naya after the Camp Grant massacre, about her 7 years of service to the community, about the character of a man who'd take in an Apache woman, when doing so invited persecution. But none of it proved conspiracy. None of it showed the connection between Caldwell and Blackwood that would turn foreclosure into fraud. Judge Wallace looked unconvinced. "Mr. Mitchell, this testimony speaks well of your character and poorly of Mr. Blackwood's methods. But unless you can prove that Mr. Caldwell's foreclosure action is fraudulent rather than legitimate banking practice, I have no legal grounds to deny his petition." Jackson's heart sank. They were losing. All the testimony, all the witnesses, all the truth in the world didn't matter without hard evidence. Then the courtroom door opened. Thomas Caldwell entered carrying a leather portfolio, his face pale but determined. Vernon Caldwell's expression went from confused to horrified in the space of a heartbeat. "Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice only slightly shaking, "I have evidence relevant to this case." "And you are Thomas Caldwell, Vernon Caldwell's son." He opened the portfolio, removing a stack of documents. "These are letters between my father and Marcus Blackwood outlining their plan to acquire Mitchell's ranch through foreclosure. They also discuss how to orchestrate attacks that would depreciate the property value while remaining legally defensible." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Wallace banged his gavel for silence. "Approach the bench, both of you." Thomas and Vernon Caldwell stood before the judge. Father and son separated by a distance that had nothing to do with physical space. Wallace examined the documents with increasing intensity, his expression darkening with each page. "These appear to be authentic," Wallace said finally. "Mr. Caldwell, do you deny writing these letters?" Vernon's face had gone red. "Your Honor, private correspondence between business associates doesn't prove anything illegal. It proves fraud when the business associates are conspiring to use the legal system to steal property." Wallace's voice carried the cold anger of a man whose court had been used for criminal purposes. "It proves that this foreclosure action is not legitimate banking, but part of an organized scheme to deprive Mr. Mitchell of his land through manufactured crisis." He turned to Jackson. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm denying the petition for foreclosure. Furthermore, I'm ordering a full investigation into Vernon Caldwell's banking practices and Marcus Blackwood's business dealings. If half of what these documents suggest is true, both men will face criminal charges." The courtroom exploded. Carolyn jumped to her feet, her face split by a smile Jackson hadn't seen in years. Dr. Owen and Eleanor Hargrove embraced like old friends. Father Miguel clasped his hands in prayer or relief or both. And Naya, sitting quietly in the back row where she'd stayed throughout the proceedings, allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile. Vernon Caldwell stared at his son with an expression of such betrayal and rage that Thomas actually stepped back. "You've destroyed everything. Everything I built, everything I planned to leave you. You weren't building, Father. You were stealing, and I won't inherit that." Thomas's voice was steady now, the shaking gone. "I'd rather have nothing and be able to sleep at night." Vernon stormed from the courtroom without another word, leaving Thomas standing alone. Jackson approached him, extending his hand. Thank you. You saved my family. I did what should have been done months ago. Thomas shook Jackson's hand, then looked past him to where Naya sat. Miss Whitehorse, I owe you an apology. My father said terrible things about you. I believed them because it was easier than questioning. I'm sorry. Naya stood moving forward with her characteristic grace. You chose truth over comfort. That is rare. You have nothing to apologize for. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Word spread fast in small towns, especially when it involved powerful men being brought low. Jackson found himself surrounded by ranchers and townspeople, some offering congratulations, others just wanting to witness history being made. Jacob Thornton appeared grinning wider than Jackson had ever seen. You did it, Mitchell. You actually beat them. We did it. None of this happens without everyone who testified. True enough, but don't celebrate too long. Blackwood's still out there, and he's not going to take this quietly. Jacob was right. The foreclosure was stopped, but the larger fight remained. Blackwood still wanted, the land still had money and guns, and the kind of ruthlessness that didn't quit just because one scheme failed. But today Jackson allowed himself to feel the victory. His children would sleep in their home tonight. His ranch was safe, at least for now. And the community had stood with him when it mattered most. As the sun set over Prescott, painting the town in shades of gold and orange, Jackson stood with Naya and Caroline, watching the last light fade. What happens now? Caroline asked. Now we go home, Jackson said, and we keep fighting. Will Blackwood attack again? Jackson looked at Naya, who nodded slightly. The truth, always the truth. Probably. But we'll be ready, and next time we won't be fighting alone. Caroline considered this, then nodded with a maturity beyond her years. Then let's go home. Sam and Grace will want to hear about this. They climbed into the wagon, Thomas Caldwell joining them, because he had nowhere else to go now that his father had disowned him. The young man sat quietly staring at his hands, probably wondering if doing the right thing was supposed to feel this complicated. You can stay at the ranch, Jackson offered, until you figure out your next step. I couldn't impose. It's not imposing. It's repaying a debt. You gave me my home back. The least I can do is share it for a while. Thomas nodded, his eyes bright with what might have been tears. Thank you. As they rode through the gathering darkness toward Mitchell Ranch, Jackson felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years and 4 months. Not happiness exactly, not even hope, but possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. He was wrong, of course. The worst was still coming, arriving with guns and fire, and the kind of violence that marked the difference between legal battles and actual war. But for tonight, riding home with his daughter beside him and Naya silent and steady on the other side, Jackson allowed himself to believe that fighting was worth it. That standing your ground mattered. That justice, however imperfect and temporary, was still worth pursuing. And that sometimes, just sometimes, the people you least expected would stand up and do the right thing when it counted most. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The night after the court victory, Jackson slept for 4 hours straight, the first uninterrupted rest he'd managed since Grace's illness began. He woke to find Naya already in the kitchen preparing breakfast, while Thomas Caldwell sat at the table nursing coffee and looking like a man still processing the destruction of his entire previous life. "Morning," Jackson said. Thomas looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "Is it? I keep thinking I'll wake up and yesterday will have been a dream, or a nightmare depending on perspective. You did the right thing." "Did I?" "My father spent 20 years building his business. I destroyed it in 20 minutes. Thomas stared into his coffee like it might hold answers. "He'll never speak to me again. My mother wrote me a letter this morning saying I'm no longer welcome at home. I have $47 to my name and nowhere to go." Naya set a plate of eggs and biscuits in front of him. "You have somewhere to go, you are here, and $47 is more than many people have when they start over." You started over with less, didn't you, after Camp Grant? I started over with nothing except the knowledge that I had survived when I should not have. That is a heavy thing to carry, but it is also freedom in its way. You have no obligations to the past now, only to the future you choose to build. Thomas picked at his food, and Jackson saw the weight settling on the young man's shoulders. Doing right was supposed to feel triumphant, but mostly it just felt complicated. Caroline and Samuel came downstairs, followed by Grace, who'd slept through the night again for the 18th consecutive time. Small miracles accumulating into something approaching normal life. "Is it true we get to keep the ranch?" Samuel asked, his 9-year-old directness cutting through adult complexity. "It's true." "Good. I don't want to leave." Samuel sat down immediately, attacking his breakfast with the efficiency of growing boys everywhere. "Are the bad men going to come back?" Jackson exchanged a glance with Naya. The truth, always the truth. "Probably, but we'll be ready." They didn't have to wait long. Marcus Blackwood himself arrived 3 days later on October 20th, riding at the head of 15 men. But this time he came in daylight, and he came alone to the house, while his hired guns waited at a distance that was technically non-threatening, but practically quite the opposite. Jackson met him on the porch with Naya beside him and Jacob Thornton visible in the barn loft. The message was clear: you can talk, but you can't intimidate. "Mitchell." Blackwood's voice was pleasant, almost friendly, which made him more dangerous than if he'd been openly hostile. "Congratulations on your court victory. Impressive work." "What do you want, Blackwood?" "To be neighborly, to clear the air." Blackwood dismounted, though he didn't approach the porch. "I had nothing to do with Caldwell's foreclosure attempt. That was his scheme, his greed. I was merely a potential buyer had the property become available." "The documents Thomas produced say different." "Documents can be misinterpreted, taken out of context." Blackwood's smile never wavered. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because despite our unfortunate misunderstanding, I'm still interested in purchasing your land, $3,000. Final offer." "Not for sale. Everything is for sale, Mitchell. It's just a matter of price." Blackwood's eyes drifted to Naya, and something cold flickered there. "Though I wonder if you've considered the costs of not selling, the attention your household has attracted, the questions people are asking about the Apache woman living under your roof." Jackson felt anger rise but kept his voice level. "What people say doesn't concern me." "Perhaps it should, because here's the thing about small communities. They tolerate unusual arrangements when forced to, but they don't like them. And when tolerance runs out, things get ugly." Blackwood's voice dropped, losing its false friendliness. "How long before someone questions whether it's appropriate for your children to be raised by a woman whose people massacred settlers? How long before the church gets involved or the territorial authorities? Is that a threat? It's an observation. I'm a practical man, Mitchell. I want your land true enough. But I'm not going to burn it or steal it or force you off. That's too messy, too expensive. Instead, I'm going to let society do my work for me. I give it 3 months before the pressure becomes unbearable. Then you'll sell, not because I forced you, but because you'll have no other choice." He remounted his horse, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "The offer stands for 30 days. After that, I start paying attention to who does business with you, who extends you credit, who's willing to be seen associating with a man harboring an Apache. Small towns can be very lonely places when the right people decide you're not worth knowing." Blackwood rode away, his 15 hired guns following, leaving a threat that felt more dangerous than any nighttime attack because it was probably true. "He is clever," Naya said quietly. "He cannot break you with violence, so he will use isolation." "Will it work?" "It might. People are afraid. Fear makes them cruel, even when they do not wish to be." She turned to look at Jackson directly. "But I can leave. If my presence endangers your family, I will go." "No." The word came out harder than Jackson intended. "We don't negotiate with bullies. We don't give them what they want just because they threaten us. Even if what they want is me, Jackson met her eyes, seeing the depth of sacrifice she was offering. She would walk away to protect his children, would disappear back into a world that had no place for her, all to spare them the consequences of her presence. But he'd lost Sarah to disease he couldn't fight. He'd almost lost Grace to fever that seemed unstoppable. He'd nearly lost his ranch to legal manipulation. He was done losing things that mattered. "Especially then," he said. "You're not going anywhere." That evening, after the children were in bed, Jackson found Thomas sitting on the porch staring at the valley like it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "You settling in?" Jackson asked. "As much as a man can settle into the wreckage of his former life." Thomas looked up. "I've been thinking about what Blackwood said, about society turning against you. He's not wrong, you know. My father had already started that campaign before the trial, spreading rumors, questioning your judgment, suggesting that Naya's presence indicated moral corruption. Let people talk. It's not just talk, though. It's economic warfare. If merchants won't sell to you, if other ranchers won't trade, if the bank won't extend credit, you can't survive out here." Thomas leaned forward. "But what if we gave them something else to think about? Something that made it harder to ostracize you?" "Like what?" "Like a wedding." Jackson stared at him. "What? Marry her. Marry Naya." Thomas spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other. "Think about it. Right now she's an Apache woman living with a widower, which invites every kind of ugly speculation. But if she's your wife legally married in front of God and community, that changes everything. It makes her respectable, protected, part of society instead of outside it. That's insane. Is it, or is it the one move Blackwood can't counter? He's counting on prejudice and whispers to destroy you. But marriage is a sacrament. It carries legal weight, and more importantly, it forces people to make a choice: accept your wife, or openly declare they won't do business with a legally married couple. Most won't go that far." Jackson opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. Because underneath the crazy surface, Thomas's logic made a certain kind of sense. Naya was already essential to his household, already raising his children, already standing beside him in every fight. The only thing missing was the legal recognition. But marriage meant something. It wasn't a tactical move or a business arrangement. It was a commitment, a promise, a joining of lives that should come from love, not strategy. "I can't marry her just to outmaneuver Blackwood," Jackson said. "Then don't marry her for that. Marry her because she saved your daughter, because she's fought beside you, because your children love her and she loves them." Thomas stood moving toward the door. "Marry her, because in 3 months of her being here, your family has become whole again in ways it hasn't been since your wife died. The tactical advantage is just a bonus." He went inside, leaving Jackson alone with thoughts that refused to settle into any comfortable pattern. Did he love Naya? The question felt both absurd and impossible to avoid. She was nothing like Sarah, who'd been gentle and bookish, and believed the world could be made better through education and kindness. Naya was hard edges and practical survival shaped by violence and loss into something that bent but never broke. But when Grace laughed, it was because Naya had told her a story. When Samuel learned something new, it was because Naya had taught him. When Caroline smiled rare and precious, it was usually in response to something Naya had said or done. And when Jackson felt the weight of everything pressing down, it was Naya who stood beside him without being asked, sharing the burden through simple presence. Was that love, or was it just gratitude and need, wearing love's clothing? He didn't have an answer, but he knew he didn't want Naya to leave. And he knew that Blackwood's threat was real, that social pressure could accomplish what violence and legal manipulation had failed to achieve. The next morning, Jackson asked Naya to walk with him. They headed into the valley, following the creek that ran along the property's eastern border, moving in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over weeks of working side by side. "Thomas had an interesting idea last night," Jackson said finally. "I heard. The walls are thin." Of course she'd heard. Naya missed nothing, learned everything, forgot less. What do you think about it? I think Thomas Caldwell is young and sees marriage as a strategy game. He does not understand that marriage is more than legal papers. Naya kept walking, her eyes on the path ahead. But I also think he is not entirely wrong. Society will destroy you if given the chance. Marriage would make that harder. That's not a good reason to get married. No, it is not. She stopped, turning to face him. So tell me the good reason if one exists. Jackson looked at her, really looked, seeing past the Apache features that frightened so many people to the woman underneath. Strong, yes. Capable, certainly. But also wounded in ways that might never fully heal, carrying losses that would haunt her for whatever years remained. Not so different from him, really. The good reason is that my children need a mother. And you're already filling that role better than anyone I could hire or find. He paused. The good reason is that I need a partner, someone who doesn't flinch when things get hard. And you've proven you're that person. Those are practical reasons, not romantic ones. I'm not a romantic man, Naya. I'm a widower with 3 kids and a failing ranch, fighting a battle against forces that want to destroy me. Romance is a luxury I can't afford. Jackson took a breath. But respect, partnership, shared purpose, those things I can offer. And maybe that's enough foundation to build something real on. Naya was quiet for a long time, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. After Camp Grant, I thought I would never have family again, that I would spend my life alone helping other people's children because mine were gone. When I came here, I thought it was temporary. Another family to help before moving on to the next tragedy. She met his eyes. But your children feel like mine now. This ranch feels like home, and you feel like someone I could stand beside for however many years remain. Is that a yes? It is a yes to partnership, to building something together, to protecting these children and this land. She paused. Whether it becomes more than that, time will tell. But yes, Jackson Mitchell, I will marry you. They stood there in the valley, 2 broken people agreeing to try being whole together. And Jackson felt something shift in his chest. Not love, not yet, but possibility. The sense that, maybe against all odds, this could work. Father Miguel agreed to perform the ceremony on October 27th, giving them a week to prepare. The timing was deliberate, fast enough to counter Blackwood's social campaign, slow enough to not seem panicked or desperate. Word spread through Prescott faster than wildfire. The widowed rancher was marrying his Apache housekeeper. Reactions ranged from scandalized outrage to grudging acceptance to surprisingly genuine support from people who'd been helped by Naya's healing over the years. Eleanor Hargrove announced she would attend, which swung a significant portion of Prescott's social elite toward acceptance. Dr. Margaret Owen offered to host a small reception at her home. Jacob Thornton volunteered to stand as Jackson's witness, but not everyone was pleased. On October 25th, 2 days before the wedding, Sheriff Walter Grimes appeared at the ranch with an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Mitchell, need to speak with you. They talked in the yard away from the house where Naya was teaching Caroline how to sew a proper wedding dress from fabric Dr. Owen had donated. I've been asked to deliver a message, Grimes said. Unofficial, you understand. Just one concerned citizen to another. From Blackwood. I can't confirm that, but the message is, this proceeding with this wedding will have consequences, social consequences, business consequences, the kind that make it very hard to operate a ranch in this territory. Jackson felt anger rise, but kept it controlled. Is that a threat from you, Sheriff? Or are you just the messenger? I'm the messenger. And frankly, between you and me, I think what you're doing takes more courage than most men have. Grimes shifted uncomfortably. But courage doesn't pay bills or feed children. You sure you want to do this? More sure than I've been about anything since Sarah died. Then I wish you luck. You're going to need it. The sheriff left, and Jackson watched him go, knowing that Grimes was right. This marriage would have consequences, some they could anticipate, and many they couldn't. But the alternative was letting fear dictate his life, and he'd done enough of that already. The wedding took place on a cold October morning with clouds threatening rain that never quite arrived. The mission chapel was small, holding maybe 50 people at capacity, and it was full. Friends, neighbors, the curious, the supportive, and probably a few who'd come just to witness what they considered a scandal. Jackson stood at the altar in his funeral suit, newly cleaned, with Thomas Caldwell beside him, looking nervous and proud in equal measure. Caroline, Samuel, and Grace sat in the front row dressed in their Sunday best, watching with expressions ranging from excitement to solemnity to barely contained glee. Then Naya appeared at the chapel entrance, and Jackson's breath caught. She wore a simple dress the color of cream made by Caroline with help from Dr. Owen and probably half the women in Prescott who decided this wedding was worth supporting. Her long black hair hung loose for once, falling past her shoulders like dark water. She carried wildflowers gathered from the valley, and she walked down the aisle with her head high and her eyes forward, refusing to be diminished by those who disapproved. Father Miguel performed the ceremony with quiet dignity, speaking about partnership and courage, about building families from the ruins of loss, about love that came not from romance, but from choosing to stand together against whatever came. Do you, Jackson Cole Mitchell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward? I do. And do you, Naichi Whitehorse, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward? I do. Then, by the power vested in me by God and the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you husband and wife. Jackson, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was brief, almost formal, but when Jackson pulled back, Naya was smiling, really smiling, not the small, careful expression she usually allowed herself, but something genuine and unguarded. The congregation erupted in applause, though Jackson noticed some people sitting with arms crossed, faces set in disapproval. Let them disapprove. They'd made their choice, and he'd made his. The reception at Dr. Owen's home was modest but joyful. Grace declared herself the happiest person in the world because she finally had a mama again. Samuel asked if this meant Naya would teach him more Apache tracking skills, which she promised to do. Even Caroline, who'd been cautious about the marriage despite helping plan it, seemed genuinely pleased. Mama would have liked her, Caroline said quietly to Jackson, while Naya was occupied with well-wishers. Not at first, maybe, but eventually. Mama always liked people who were stronger than they seemed. Your mama was one of those people. So was Naya. Caroline squeezed his hand. You did good, Papa. Coming from his eldest daughter, it meant everything. But the celebration couldn't last forever. As evening approached and guests began departing, Jackson noticed Marcus Blackwood's foreman watching from across the street. Not threatening, not doing anything illegal, just observing, taking notes, reporting back to his employer that the wedding had happened, that the community had accepted it more than anticipated, that the social isolation strategy had failed, which meant Blackwood would try something else. The attack came that night, as if Blackwood had been waiting for the wedding to conclude before making his final move. 15 men, maybe more, descending on the Mitchell ranch with torches and guns and the kind of organized purpose that spoke to military planning. But Jackson had anticipated this, had prepared for it, had turned his ranch into a fortress over the past 2 weeks while pretending to focus on wedding preparations. The children were already in the reinforced shelter beneath the barn, this time with Emma Thornton and Dr. Owen standing guard. Jacob Thornton was in the loft with enough ammunition to fight a small war. Father Miguel, despite his age and vocation, had positioned himself in the house with a rifle and a determination that suggested his faith didn't preclude self-defense. Thomas Caldwell, surprisingly, had proven handy with a gun, taking a position on the house's second floor with clear sightlines across the yard. And Naya Jackson's wife of less than 12 hours stood beside him in the barn's ground floor, her bow strung and her expression calm as deep water. "Are you ready?" Jackson asked her. "I have been ready for this my entire life. The question is whether they are ready for us." The riders came fast, spreading out to surround the ranch, their tactics better than the previous attacks. These weren't just hired thugs. These were professional gunsmen who knew how to fight and had been paid well to end this once and for all. The lead rider called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Last chance, Mitchell. Come out peacefully, sign the deed over to Mr. Blackwood, and nobody gets hurt. Fight, and we burn everything to the ground with you in it." Jackson's response was to fire a single shot over their heads, the crack of his rifle clear statement of intent. Then the night exploded into violence. The battle lasted 23 minutes, though. Afterward, Jackson would swear it felt like hours. Gunfire lit the darkness in stuttering flashes. Jacob's Henry rifle spoke in measured rhythm, each shot carefully aimed, several finding targets. Thomas proved surprisingly competent, his shots keeping riders pinned down on the eastern approach. Father Miguel's shotgun boomed twice the spread pattern, more effective at deterring than killing, but no less important for that. And Naya's arrows fell like silent judgment, taking riders in shoulders, thighs, anywhere that disabled without killing. She'd explained her philosophy earlier. Death created blood feuds that lasted generations, but wounded men just went home. Jackson fought with the cold efficiency war had taught him, making every shot count, conserving ammunition, moving between firing positions to create the illusion of more defenders than they actually had. But the riders kept coming, kept pressing, and Jackson realized with growing dread that they might actually be overwhelmed. Then Sheriff Walter Grimes appeared with 6 deputized citizens, men from town, who'd decided that regardless of their feelings about Apache wives, watching a family be murdered was a step too far. The sheriff's voice cut through the gunfire. "Everyone stand down. This is the law, and you're all under arrest for attempted murder." The riders faced a choice: continue fighting and face hanging, or surrender and maybe avoid the noose. Most chose surrender. A few ran. And one, the lead rider, made the mistake of turning his gun toward Grimes. Jacob Thornton shot him before he could pull the trigger, the bullet catching him high in the chest and spinning him from his saddle. The fight ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the yard full of wounded men, damaged buildings, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Jackson emerged from the barn to find Grimes directing his deputies to secure the prisoners. The sheriff looked tired, like he'd aged years in the past month. "This should end it," Grimes said. "These men will talk. They'll implicate Blackwood. He'll face trial for attempted murder, conspiracy, probably a dozen other charges. Will he hang? Probably not. Men like Blackwood have lawyers, money connections. But he'll be ruined, disgraced, and that might be punishment enough." Jackson nodded, too exhausted to feel triumph or even relief. They'd survived. His family was safe. The ranch was damaged but standing, and that was all that mattered. In the aftermath, as dawn painted the valley in shades of gold, Jackson sat on his porch with Naya beside him, their hands clasped together, watching the sun rise over land they'd fought to keep. "What happens now?" Naya asked. "Now we rebuild, repair what's broken, raise the children, run the ranch." Jackson squeezed her hand. "Live the life we fought for. It will not be easy." "No, but we knew that going in." They sat in silence as the valley woke around them, and Jackson allowed himself to imagine the future. Not perfect, never that, but possible, real, worth fighting for. In the barn, the children emerged from their shelter, tired but safe. Grace ran to Naya, calling "Mama," which would probably never stop making Jackson's chest tighten. Samuel wanted to know if they'd won, which seemed obvious, but needed confirming anyway. Carolyn just hugged them, both fierce and protective, and exactly like her mother. Thomas Caldwell appeared, looking stunned that he'd actually shot at people and survived. Dr. Owen examined the wounded with professional detachment. Jacob Thornton started cataloging damage with the methodical care of someone who'd been through this before. and Father Miguel stood in the middle of the yard looking at the assembled defenders, the wounded attackers, the damaged but standing ranch, and smiled. "You know what this is," the priest said to no one in particular. "This is what happens when people choose courage over comfort, when they stand together instead of alone, when they decide that some things are worth fighting for, even when the cost is high." He looked at Jackson and Naya, at the blended family they'd created from loss and determination and stubborn refusal to quit. "This is what home looks like," Father Miguel said. "Not perfect, not easy, but real. And worth every scar earned defending it." Jackson looked at his wife, his children, his friends, his battered but unbroken ranch, and knew the priest was right. This was home, hard-won, blood-bought, and absolutely worth it. And as the sun climbed higher over Monument Valley, Jackson Cole Mitchell allowed himself something he hadn't felt in 2 years and 4 months. Hope. Not the fragile kind that shattered at first hardship, but the kind forged in fire and tested by loss. The kind that survived because it had no other choice. The kind that built futures from the ruins of past and refused to surrender even when surrender seemed rational. They'd won. Not perfectly, not without cost. But they'd won. And standing there with his wife, his children, his battered but unbroken home. Jackson understood that victory wasn't about perfection. It was about survival with honor intact. For now, and for whatever came next, that mattered more than any easy triumph ever could. Epilogue across the years. 3 years passed. In the spring of 1881, Naya gave birth to a son in the same bedroom where Grace had nearly died. They named him Thomas, after the young man who'd sacrificed everything to do what was right. Thomas Caldwell himself, now the ranch foreman, wept when he heard. The Mitchell Ranch recovered slowly but surely. 180 head of cattle by year's end. The fences rebuilt stronger than before. And the underground spring, the source of all the conflict, was shared freely with 7 neighboring ranches. What Blackwood had wanted to monopolize Jackson turned into communal resource. Marcus Blackwood died in prison in 1883. His empire collapsed his name, a warning rather than a legacy. Vernon Caldwell lived longer, bitter and alone, dying in 1892 without his son ever speaking to him again. 7 years after the wedding in 1885, Naya opened a small school in a building the community built for her. She taught Apache Mexican and white children side by side using methods that blended traditional wisdom with formal education. Carolyn, now 19, became her teaching assistant. Samuel took over much of the ranch work at 16, revealing a natural talent for animal husbandry that would make the Mitchell Ranch known throughout the territory for quality livestock. Grace grew into a young woman who remembered her sickness only as distant dream, kept alive by her parents' stories of the woman who'd saved her life and stayed to become her mother. 15 years after that October wedding in 1893, Grace married a young lawyer from Prescott. Her wedding was attended by 200 people, Apache and white, rich and poor, all gathered to celebrate a family that had become symbol of what Arizona Territory could be when people chose courage over fear. 40 years after Jackson first met Naya in 1918, they sat on the same porch where they'd fought off Blackwood's men. The Great War had just ended. Their grandson, also named Thomas, had survived the trenches of France and was coming home. "Do you remember that first night?" Jackson asked, his voice roughened by age but still strong. "When Father Miguel brought you here and I didn't want to let you in?" Naya, her hair now silver but her eyes still sharp, smiled. "I remember thinking you were a fool, letting pride endanger your daughter." "I was a fool. In many ways I still am." "Yes, but you are my fool." She took his hand fingers, intertwining with the ease of 4 decades of practice. "And I would not trade these years for anything." Jackson lived to see his 84th birthday in 1938, the same year he told his grandson James about the woman who'd taught him courage. He passed peacefully 1 week after James shipped out to war Naya, holding his hand as she had for 40 years. His last words were, "Tell the children I'm proud of them. Tell James to come home." Naya followed him within the year, dying in 1939 at 89, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, who carried both Apache and white blood in their veins, and saw no contradiction in that. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through generations, each adding their own chapter to the story. And in 1985, more than a century after that October when everything changed, Jackson and Naya's great-great-granddaughter stood on the same porch, looking at the same valley, teaching her own daughter about the woman who'd ridden into Monument Valley with nothing but knowledge and courage, and the man who'd been brave enough to see past his own fear. The fence Jackson and Naya had rebuilt in 1879 still stood weathered but unbroken, not because it was stronger than other fences, but because they had chosen to protect what was inside. And what was inside family loved justice, the stubborn refusal to surrender to hate, proved worth protecting across more than a century of storms. Return to 1938. The old man's voice faded into silence. His grandson James sat motionless, the photograph of Jackson and Naya's wedding still clutched in his hands. Outside the window, the same Arizona sun that had witnessed everything still painted Monument Valley in shades of copper and gold. "So you fought," James said, finally his voice barely above a whisper, "and you won. We fought. We survived. Winning is more complicated than that." Jackson Cole Mitchell, 84 years old and carrying every one of those years in his weathered hands, leaned forward in his rocking chair. "Your great-grandmother Naya, she used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about choosing to act despite the fear. She knew that better than anyone." James looked down at the photograph at the young couple standing before Father Miguel, surrounded by people who'd chosen to stand with them. "I'm still scared, Grandpa. About the war. About dying somewhere I've never been for reasons I don't fully understand." "Good. Fear keeps you careful. It's not fear that destroys men, James. It's letting fear make your decisions." The old man stood slowly, joints protesting, and moved to the window. The valley stretched before him, unchanged by decades, holding memories in every shadow. "Your great-grandmother survived a massacre. I survived losing everything twice over. You come from survivors. That's not just blood, that's legacy." He turned back to his grandson, and for a moment James could see the young widower who'd fought impossible odds and won. "When you're out there, when you're afraid and alone, and wondering if any of it matters, remember this. The fence we built in 1879 still stands, not because we made it perfect, but because we chose to protect what was inside it: family, honor, the stubborn refusal to let hate win." James stood clutching the photograph like a talisman. "I'll come back, Grandpa, I promise." Jackson smiled, though his eyes held the weight of knowing that some promises were beyond anyone's control. "I know you will, son, and when you do this, Valley will be waiting. Same sun, same sky, same land that taught your great-grandmother and me that home isn't a place." "What is it then?" "It's the people you choose to stand beside when the world tries to break you. It's the courage to keep standing even when the cost is high." He placed his hand on James's shoulder, the same hand that had held a rifle, held Naya's hand, held generations of children who carried forward what they'd built. "Now go. Make us proud." James embraced his grandfather, perhaps for the last time, then walked toward the door where his future waited. At the threshold, he turned back one final time. Jackson stood silhouetted against the window, the Arizona sun behind him, looking exactly as he had 60 years ago when he'd chosen to fight rather than surrender. Still standing, still unbroken. "The fence still stands, Grandpa, because we chose to protect what was inside." James nodded, understanding, finally settling into his bones like marrow. Then he was gone off to his own war, carrying with him the story of two people who'd loved fiercely enough to change what seemed unchangeable. Jackson returned to his rocking chair, the photograph back on the mantel where it belonged. Through the window he could see the barn where Naya had first slept, the porch where they'd sat through countless evenings, the valley that had witnessed everything. Naya had been gone only months, but he felt her presence in every board of this house, every stone of this land. Soon he would join her. The thought didn't frighten him. They'd had 40 years, 3 children, 11 grandchildren, 6 great-grandchildren, and counting. They'd built something that would outlast them both, something worth more than land or money or easy victories. They'd built a home. And as the Arizona sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Jackson Cole Mitchell allowed himself one final smile, remembering the night a wagon had brought an Apache woman to his door and everything had changed. "I see you, Naya," he whispered to the valley, to the wind, to the memories that would never fully leave. "I still see you." The rocking chair creaked softly as he settled back, watching the same sunset they'd watched together for 40 years, waiting for the darkness that no longer frightened him. Because he knew what was on the other side. Home.